Hello, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of Texas National Security Review. In this edition of the podcast, Frank Gavin, Chairman of the Editorial Board of Texas National Security Review, interviews Robert Jervis. Jervis is one of the most prominent and prolific political scientists of our time, author of such classics as Perception and Misperception in International Politics, Why Intelligence Fails, an examination of the intelligence leading up to the Second Iraq War, and The Meaning of the Nuclear Revolution, a 1989 volume, which looked at how advances in accuracy in nuclear weapons changed the dynamic of deterrence and second strike. In this wide-ranging interview, Gavin and Jervis discuss the state of the political science field, the ability of scholars to influence policy, and how Jervis came to be the prominent and influential scholar that he is today. This interview was recorded during the University of Texas Clements Center Summer Seminar on History, Statecraft, and Diplomacy.
Well, thank you, Mark. And this is obviously an extraordinary honor and pleasure. I mean, I think Bob Jervis is just so much that one could say. I was trying to read the various biographies of him, and it's incredibly impressive and incredibly daunting. Of course, the premier international relations scholar of the decades. Logic of Images, Perception and Misperception, The Nuclear Revolution. My favorite book, System Effects, which I know that is very underappreciated, but I think is just one of my all-time favorite books. Completely has shaped the way not just one field looks at international relations, but had all sorts of effects on history, on psychology, your work with the policy world, especially the intelligence community, bridging disciplines. And so, it's very intimidating to think about how to sort of structure Q&A with you. And as I was thinking about this, I thought one of the real opportunities here is we have these amazing emerging scholars. And so if you didn't mind, I thought what we would do is go back to Bob Jervis at the start of his career. I was talking to Diana earlier about the great Oberlin College and all this sort of international relations talent that was produced there. Ken Waltz, Richard Haas, our own great Diana over there, you. And so I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit about your time first at Oberlin, why you decided to get a PhD, and what graduate school was like for you as you sort of started your career.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. It's a real pleasure to be here, and also to do what I can to encourage the younger generation. I find at my age there are more and more younger generations. But one thing is there's a myth about I started Oberlin in 1958. A myth about the 1950s, everyone was quiescent, it's just totally wrong, at least for my milieu growing up as a teenager in New York, a very, very political era, and both in terms of partisan politics, or the idea that, people weren't concerned about the international politics. We'd had the Korean War, you'd had civil defense drills of all this. The Russians were coming. This was politics in general, and international politics was very strong in the atmosphere. And Oberlin, as a college, always attracted people who were quite both interested in studying politics and a degree of political activism. We had political protests before political protests were invented, so it prepared me for Berkeley. That was a very important part, and also important part of how I got into this business, although I've got to go back a little bit, that as you know from some of the interviews or biography I've done, that being born in 1940 and then being aware of the world when I was 5, 6, and 7, you couldn't avoid nuclear weapons and also the beginnings of the Cold War. And I remember pestering my parents, and this was when the historians may know, one of the American, what we now know were spy planes, shot down along the periphery of the Soviet Union. And of course, I couldn't believe we do anything like invade Soviet sovereignty or do anything illegitimate. So obviously, if our plane was shot down, it was total wrongdoing on the other side. But pestering my parents, well, should we shoot back? I mean, the basic question of should you do conciliation or force, which ends up as one of the threads of the basic question that runs through things I've done research on, and we face today with things like dealing with North Korea. It took those questions into the Oberlin, and this was the era of the missile gap, which we now know was a gap in our favor, and the stories of how we got there and all that marvelous stuff about the role of intelligence in there and some. And I wrote a paper just for my own benefit on the missile gap and the question of what it meant. And it was an atmosphere that would really, encourage that in terms not so much, although some of the interests of the faculty, but the interests of the fellow students. And I've always been struck with the importance of what I call peer relations that I learned at Oberlin and at Berkeley. I had good professors, but I learned much more from my peers than my professors. Not because my colleagues were better than the professors, although they were very good, but just the intensive, prolonged, in-depth interaction you can get from your friends and people who are interested in the same things you are and are roughly the same level, that is such an indispensable part of the education. And I'm not sure we see it as much now, certainly at the college level. I hope we see it at the graduate level. My sense of the undergraduates at Columbia, although I must admit, I teach 2 undergraduate courses, but they're not going to tell me how they live. But my sense is you don't quite have that as much.
Something I want to follow up on, because one of the things when you read your biography, and I've heard you talk about this before, is you're someone who's very politically engaged. I get the impression of the Jervis household being one where there was lots of political argument. You were at Oberlin, then Berkeley at the height of the sort of political disputes, political arguments. Yet your scholarship has always, it's been, I think, a point of pride for you to focus on the social science aspect, to be dispassionate. And in fact, I remember one of the things that you wrote, I disagreed with this, but the difference between historians and political scientists was that historians engage moral questions and political scientists don't. I think that you just all are better at hiding it. But how did someone who's learning about these things at a time of political fervor and who was engaged in that, then turn around and develop this scholarly profile that really, in such an admirable way, strove for being a dispassionate social scientist? How did you come to that, and how have you thought about that over the years?
Yeah, that's a very important and large question, and 2 or 3 aspects of it. One is I was always interested in why do different groups, what are the intellectual sources of important political disputes? And in fact, I got on my dissertation topic, which was in an odd way, in that there was a big conference, quite important conference in Berkeley in, 64, I think, about deterrence. And there was, in the late 50s and early 60s, big debate about deterrence theory. If you know chapter 3 of perception, misperception, and effect spiral versus deterrence, I won't go through all that. But there was a very important conference that dealt with that. And Tom Schelling and Anatole Rappaport gave public talks. And in hearing them, I came to the conclusion, which I develop in chapter 3, debatable, I think it's still essentially right, that the two of them did not have different general theories about the world, but had different views about the Soviet Union and what the effect of conciliation or threats would be in this particular situation, not generally. And that helped focus my what I've done a lot and what I'm working on now, one paper on differences in the grand strategies, the deep engagers versus the restrainers. Why do the people disagree? And that I finds a useful perspective, because then even when you come down on one side or the other, that I think can help do two things. It helps see, gee, the other, that other group may be wrong, but they're not minis. And, that's a useful way to go into the political dialogue, even if it's hard to do today. And then second, it leads to the social science question, okay, what do they differ on? What sort of theories might lie behind that? What evidence might we get to try to discriminate between the views? And that, I think, you can, if you keep that perspective, it doesn't mean you're not going to then end up with strong policy views, but it does mean you can keep the focus on the social science. The other part is that I'm also often really ambivalent on some major policy issues that take the one today, if we will, to deep engagers versus restrainers to over polarize it. I've got sympathy with both of those views, and in some ways an ambivalence which would not probably be helpful if I were a policymaker may be useful then in getting the social science perspective of looking for the evidence on this. And I'll just mention one which just comes up that I read in the spring the books by Steve Wald and John Mearsheimer, which are very, very interesting and very well done within their parameters. But I was unhappy, and I've written a review essay that will come out in Security Studies, arguing, I think to be fair to say, pointing out that they both attribute what they see as the errors of American foreign policy, position I generally agree with, to what Walt would call second image. They each do a different version of second image, but it's all second image. And they provide no real evidence for why we should believe a second image as opposed, obviously, to a third image, or even some other things. No engagement in counterfactuals, no use of the hypothetico-deductive method, that is saying, what would we expect America to be if my analysis of what America is like, and I think do it that way, you see a very different picture. So that I think that my sense when I approach those books, and I agree with a lot of their description and some of their explanation, but the ambivalence then makes it easier to say, wait a minute, look, we really should use some of our standard social science methods on this to see if how the argument stands up.
So you don't know how tempted I am to pursue this line for reasons that Jim and Phil and others would know. But I think turning this into 90 minutes to explain everything that's wrong with Walt and Mearsheimer, probably they're more productive things to do. But I do think there is a very important thread here where you don't give yourself enough credit, which if it's hard enough now for two leading international relations professors to hide their sort of prescriptive or not do proper social science, I can imagine it's 1968, 1970, you're writing Logic of Images, the pressure to maintain a social science perspective. I mean, in our field, in history, this was a time where, arguably you could look back at the scholarship, and this is probably where you got your argument from, where in the midst of the Vietnam War, it was very difficult to maintain that position. So it's actually more impressive that you were able to do this. And I guess, and I'm sure every young scholar here will face this. Did you have those pressures, and how did you deal with it when someone said, well, this is great that you're talking about perception and misperception in this dispassionate way, but the American empire is ruthlessly killing people in Southeast Asia, and you need to make a stand on it. I mean, how did you, because you've done that through your whole career, and it's really impressive. And I wonder if you could, how did you deal with those pressures?
It's interesting. I mean, Vietnam, of course, was the major issue starting in 63, and interesting enough, I took a seminar with Chalmers Johnson, who any of you who do East Asia know. Chalmers, again, the way in which personality influences your. At this point, Chalmers was an extreme hawk.
Wow.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
See, that's the point. It's funny. Well, he and Dan Ellsberg, somebody quite parallel. I don't know if they knew each other, but that is, they moved from one extreme to the other without slowing down for the middle. But I did a paper on what we then call internal war, what we now call the counterinsurgency, which convinced me that we could not win in Vietnam. So I was always against the war, but not on the moral grounds. In a way, that made it easier, because I didn't agree with the people who said partly, yes, the war is immoral because you shouldn't fight an expensive war. It kills a lot of you and other people, and you're not going to win it. But I didn't have the same feeling that the strong moralist group had. And also, and I think this does get to what I still think is, to overgeneralize, difference between a lot of political scientists and a lot, not all certainly, of the historians, which is by studying politics and political disputes, and by being political. I was in student government, and in the free speech movement, so I was used to playing, these not big political roles, but that sort of sense of political, and that meant that I was used to dealing with people who had the other side. I don't mean to sound like Joe Biden, but had to deal with people who you disagreed with and not see them as demons, or certainly not act toward them as though they were demons. And also my attitude toward American foreign policy, partly thanks to Ken Waltz and others in the Third Image, was that country and realism. Countries do terrible things. One of my favorite operas, Così fan tutti, which is not misogynist, it's misanthropic. That is, it's not. The opera is not so critical of women, it's critical of people. So they all do it. And having the attitude that countries first seek to expand their power, are willing to do terrible harm to others for that they're hypersensitive on their security, that they make lots of mistakes. So that led me to be able to think and say, well, the war is terrible, but then this doesn't lead to what it led to many historians of that generation to totally revise, I think, their views about political leaders, the American political system, and to produce a very strong moralistic tone in a lot of the scholarship of that time that you still see, I think, on the writings, not all of it, but some of it on Vietnam. I think if you compare, well, there are not a lot of work of political scientists on Vietnam, which is too bad, because I still try to work on that. I've written 2 or 3 papers. I think it's fascinating. the way they deal with it and the way the historians deal with it. Look at what happened with Mark Moyer's book, right? Not a great book, okay? But not terrible. Certainly opened things up, did lead and should have led to some, taking another look at a whole series of questions. That's not the way it was greeted by the historians. I think the political scientists partly, if politics is sort of the thing you study all the time and you live, I think it makes it easier and better to be able to separate.
I would agree with your critique of historians, but I want to sort of push back a little on the political scientists and give you some credit. And that is, I think, one of the things that's remarkable about your writings is people like Waltz, people like Mearsheimer are hedgehogs, right? And we can talk about the sort of things that are done in the historical world and that they're sort of the moralism, but we could also spend a lot of time talking about the bludgeon that the Ken Waltzes of the world use to explain the world in such a way that's not necessarily that helpful. And you've always managed not to be a hedgehog, right? So somehow you've become our greatest IR theorist, yet you read more history than anyone I've ever met. You've got that great story, perhaps you can tell them, about Raymond Sontag when you were at graduate school. Somehow you've been able to avoid the, say, excessive moralism that you've identified in history without committing the other sin of sort of an absurd scientism and hedgehogism of some of your colleagues. And could you talk a little bit about that and how you came to sort of be in this place where you could take the best of IR theory, but also be very sensitive to context change in history?
Yeah, it's sort of hard to tell. I think the hedgehog and fox is certainly right. I mean, I certainly consider myself a fox. I mean, that I've done the things that are very different. And just one thing that I worked on a little, I want to go back to, the signaling book and the perception book are done in entirely different intellectual styles. The signaling is, in a way, premature rational choice combined with premature constructivism, because it is how people and it's quite deductive, although no equations, and quite prescriptive in a way, whereas part of it is maybe a sense of never being sure what's right. And Ken and John, and I think they would both, don't think I'm not saying anything you couldn't repeat to them. I would say to them that
they'll hear it soon enough on the podcast. So.
Well, they're very sure of their own views. And that, in a way, is very useful because it leads them to go way down certain roads that they probably couldn't without that confidence. And then it leads to something comparable drawbacks. Whereas, I'm saying, well, I'm not sure that's right. Let me try this. Let me try the other. And that may mean that I don't push some of the ideas as hard as they might be pushed. So it may just partly be sort of basic personality or view of the world. And the thing on the history, Ken was certainly very intrigued and read a lot of history. And I had the great fortune that my first or second year as what should have been was claimed to be a postdoc, it turned pre-doc at Harvard. And it was not the way the pre-docs are now, no competition. I'd send something to Tom Schelling and he liked it and we met and he said, come here for 2 years. I have all this money from the Defense Department I can spend however I like. He supported me and he supported someone who I hope some of you have heard of, who's overthrown more governments than the CIA, Gene Sharp. He was the one, some of you know, Gene was the one who systematized and worked, he was a pacifist, on civilian nonviolent. And Tom thought that was great too. So I just want to put a plug in for one of my leading mentors who I learned so much and who supported both of us. Anyway, Ken had a sabbatical. He was in the next office. And I was reading some stuff on pre-World War I, some marvelous books, and Ken said, "Oh, of course, I've known that for." I thought I was going in and telling him stuff he hadn't known, and because what he was doing didn't have much history in it. But I don't think I think he was a little more treating of the history instrumentally. And whereas I've just always, even from high school, just been fascinated, why did this happen? How did these things turn out? And, I think it just developed as I read more, but sort of can't explain, how I got it. And Tom didn't have that attitude. I pressed him on certain things because he said something about the importance of reading history, but it was clear he really didn't mean it. That just wasn't the way he thought. The way he thought was extraordinarily valuable, but I've always found both that, if you just try to figure out what happened, there are going to be ways you can use that in almost anything you're writing.
Are you comfortable with the idea of saying you're epistemologically modest? Would you be? And I guess,
yeah.
Okay, because then the question would be, one of the other great themes of your career is an engagement with the policy world, right? If you, policymakers, here you talk to anyone in the policy community, you talk about who are the scholars that influence them, you're always at the top of the list. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that relationship developed, both in terms of how you first got involved with policy, with the intelligence world, and how that interaction then shaped your scholarship, and perhaps with some lessons for the younger people here.
Two things. First, I think one reason why my scholarship has been useful, not to people obviously at the highest level, but the working level, is that it does not try to make moral judgments on the people, and that it doesn't try to pretend that we're smart, we and the academics are smarter than the policymakers. There is among too many academics, both political scientists and historians, I think a real smart-ass attitude. And one thing to separate two historians, at Berkeley, I audited, of course, Jerry Feldman, who was a very good German historian. And the course was good, but there was the feeling constant that I would have done it better than those people. And, I think that's just a terrible attitude. I mean, usually the answer is no, you wouldn't have. And why would you think that you would have? And so I've always found that attitude offensive. And I think by being able to avoid that in the scholarship, that helps. How I got in, well, first, I've never served full time, and in a way, I very much do regret that. I don't think I would have made anything better. I think I would have learned a tremendous amount, both about the process and about the substance. But what's odd, well, maybe isn't odd, does not speak terribly well for the way the U.S. government works, and somebody might disagree. The involvement really was through personal connections that, I was at Harvard as the pre-doc and then on the faculty for 6 years. Was at the Center for International Affairs, TA for Henry Kissinger, interesting. And there was someone else who was head of the CFI who you may not have known of, Bob Bowie, because Bob didn't do a lot of scholarship. He was an international lawyer. He was
with Henry all the
50s.
time. What? He just fought with Henry all the time.
Yes. They had offices across the hall and hated each other. Big fight over the MLF. But anyway, Bob was worked with Dulles, and so it really partly been more associated with the Republicans, but was brought in by Turner and Carter. I don't know who brought him in, actually, as, in effect, a deputy director for intelligence at CIA, different title that time, but anyway. And that Bob then asked me to become a scholar in residence, a program they've since abolished. Various reasons that didn't work out, but I became a part-time consultant and working on Soviet intentions. This was then in the fall of '78, and Iran blew up, and Bob had testified in October before one of the committees that things were now under control in Iran. And so he wondered, how did I go wrong? So he asked me to do the postmortem, and that really started the involvement, which has been episodic. A lot of the involvement, has been through people like Derek and Colin Call, who unfortunately for illness can't be here, and others of my former students who've gone in, and then when I go to Washington, I get a chance to talk to them and find out what's happening and to share ideas. Then I'd continued some stuff for the CIA, put on with a historical review panel that deals with declassification of historical documents, and that kept the security clearance. And that mattered because when there was the Iraq intelligence failure, and then the SISI, Senate Select Committee, produced its report, and I looked through the report and thought, oh my God, it's a competent graduate students who've provided their note cards, gotten the big questions all wrong, but they've done a good job of research, and I was able to contact people I knew who were at the high levels of CIA, mostly John McLaughlin, who you'll see I was really a marvelous guy, and say I could assemble a team of experts to take this and do some other stuff and do a much better job of what you did wrong and why you did it. And they said yes, but interesting for this and another case that I can't talk about, I reached out to them. And they, especially the CIA, the Nick is better. But even the Nick is not very good. It's such an insular world. They don't reach out.
So I think you talk to anyone in the IC, they could talk about what you brought to this process, but how did it affect your scholarship? First doing it in the '70s, then doing it again with the Iraq War, and intermittently throughout, and also being on the CIA historical. How has this interaction, and again, as advice for the younger people here, how did it shape how you pursued both your teaching and your scholarship after these?
Well, certainly, I think it definitely enriched my teaching because you learn. There are stories you can tell, and the stories are interesting in themselves and do illustrate things about how foreign policy making works. And bringing that into the classroom, I think, is extremely helpful, especially since, a lot of the IR theory can be highly abstract. I like the abstract theories, I do it, but it both brings it down to level and it can get people really involved, and also it can say, gee, this is some aspects about way the thing works. I certainly learned an enormous amount from the two big postmortems, that is the fall of the Shah and the Iraq WMD, and a couple of things that really matter. One, when I did the fall of the Shah, I was looking for, obviously, the roots of various misperceptions, and I think there were some psychological things that I did find that I think are important and right. But, if you will, what was more striking was the sociology, how the organization functioned, what the incentives, both formal and informal, were. Why? And it isn't only sociology, it's a more rational choice. How are people promoted? That what really mattered was writing something at that time for the NID, the National Intelligence Daily. This was in the 70s. The PDB was not nearly as important, but to get your item in the NID really mattered. The relation of the analysis you were to do with the reporting coming in, what you could and couldn't say about that, all sorts of things that from reading the books you'd be absolutely clueless. No way to figure that out. No theory was going to tell you that. And in the Iraq WMD, there were but other things. I'll tell the ones these are all public, and this one is in Why Intelligence Fails. The aluminum tubes, which I don't pretend to know the full story. I don't think anyone knows the full story because it's in several parts. But the degree to which idiosyncratic factors can matter, when we got the aluminum tubes, and we literally did get them. I mean, we captured them on the shipment was going into Iraq, and we intercepted it. And they literally came into CIA, and there was an analyst who had experience in centrifuge technology. And within a day and a half, he decided that these tubes were indeed for centrifuges. And what was striking, part of it idiosyncratic, that he was the only one in the organization, in that organization, not the government, with particular expertise in that. And the informal pressures to be fairly quick, because there were other agencies that were analyzing, and you wanted to get the word to your boss before people got to theirs. And then once you'd made an analysis, and I want to see if the people in the government agree, and you'd put it to the president. This was before 9/11, by the way, so no, it's not an argument of politicization or anything like that. But, this was an important issue even before 9/11. Once you'd gone to the president and the top people and said that you believe these things are designed for uranium enrichment, it's very hard to go back and say, hey, boss. Now, in fact, they did back off between this is the summer of 2011 and early 2001, sorry, yes. And the year later, they did actually back off a little. And there's some interesting thing. At one point, Condi says to Bob Walpole, Bob was the National Intelligence Officer, runs mass destruction. And this is right before the war, she said, gee, Bob, the way you're putting it now is a little different than the way you've been putting it before, and I wish you had told me earlier. But I think it was very hard people to back off. Anyway, it's a long way around it. We know that it's difficult for people to change their minds, but seeing that play out in the government context, and also the importance of the process, of the dreaded interagency process, that and the degree to which it works well or badly is first very important. Secondly, depends in part on the personalities. Is a system that you'd think on paper, well, sort of you set it up and it runs, right? No, and it takes minding and how important that is and the way it affects the policy. That was very valuable. I say, but that's only from getting small glances. The people in this room who've, spent years in there, have that in much greater, and see a lot of other things. But I think it is, I'm not saying it's a prerequisite to do good scholarship, certainly, don't think that's the case. But I do find it both fascinating in itself and enormously intellectually helpful, and also, again, helps on the humility. See how hard the problems are, how scattered the intelligence is. Let me give just one thing again on that, and the WMD. You know, conventional wisdom is the people who reach the judgment were either knaves or fools, and that's the only debate. That is, did they cave in to evil Dick Cheney? Hey, I'll sign off on that part. But did they give in to the evil pressure, or were they just complete fools? And I think all of us, this was done from a team. My colleague Dick Betts, my former student Jim Wirtz, written on the TET intelligence failure, and Mel Leffler, because Mel was on HRP, and so he had code word clearance, so he could do it, and he came at it a different way, so I wanted a person with very different perspectives. So we all came in sort of saying, were you fools or knaves? And then we read not the NIE, but the backup material. And we said, oh. And the material not all declassified. There is more. There's a lot of smoke here. It wasn't entirely crazy. Look at this piece, look at this piece. And it gives you a good sense of humility.
So that's a great story. And I want to, in you telling how you went about this, what was so fascinating was not just your own humility and your respect for the policymakers, but the different intellectual fields, disciplines you brought to it, right? So you've got IR theory, you've got psychology, you've got sociology, you have history, and which is not easy to do, right? And so one of the other great hallmarks of your career, there's a whole group of people who would know you only as an IR theorist, others who would know you only as a political psychology person, someone who would think of you as understanding the sociology of organizations, and others who I know you from the diplomatic history type of stuff you do. So I guess, which is hard. Now, I wonder if you could talk about how you thought about that, and how, especially for people starting their careers, and we all know that one of the challenges of the current academic environment is the incentives aren't to be Bob Jervis, right? The incentives are to be a narrow hedgehog, right? Which is not to be a curious, open-minded fox. And so if you could talk a little bit about how you came to that perspective with the idea of guiding our emerging scholars here.
Well, one thing is it was much easier then. The academic world was much, much smaller. That a lot of us, once you're a faculty member, even a junior, mid-level faculty, and the graduate students come in bitching about this and that, and you say, we did it, you can do it. Well, it's not quite correct. The environment is different. When I was in graduate school, there was one major journal, World Politics, which now does very little IR. It did mostly IR then, not much comparative. IO did the UN and other such fascinating international organizations. JCR was really exciting. It had just started in I think 56. So you had that. You didn't. I subscribe to at least 20 journals. How many journals does the ISA put out, for God's sake? So none of those existed. And then when I was doing the misperception, I realized a little late, but lucky it was late, that I really needed a better grounding in psych. So I read through in a year all the 10 or 15 years of the 3 or 4 psych journals. Now, I wouldn't read all of the issues. I'd look at every issue and just look at the work that was relevant to perception. And, that would be maybe one issue, one article there. So that, again, was something that was doable, right? You just can't do that now. So it is much, much harder. Partly one has to rely more on trying to do coursework, more on postdocs, and some postdocs that may have extra year of training, work on more collaborations. There's much more collaborative, either formal or informal, and there almost has to be. And the postdocs are a great help because, it takes a long time to absorb this. And if I look at especially the books in the Cornell series, but others as well, you see a lot of really good scholarship, and most of that just takes a good deal of time. And of course, it's difficult with the tenure clock. It's difficult with family life. And that's a question of whether we're setting the tenure clock all wrong, but that's a different issue. But I think you have to recognize that it is harder now. On the other hand, there are a couple of things that are shortcuts that are legitimate first, if not last steps. There are more review articles. There are the roundtables in HDiplo and ISSF that, if we say so ourselves, are very valuable. That it's at least the first step before reading the book, and sometimes
even more interesting than the book.
Yes, yes.
I'd say one you did this week, the roundtable, was more interesting than the book.
The one that came out was on Walt's book. Yeah. The one on Mearsheimer is better. I did the introduction, to that, so it'll be out. It takes a while to just the production, even though it's never in print. So in the fall, look for the one on Mearsheimer. I think that's even better than the one on Walt. So that's really very useful. And of course, it does it for the diplomatic history. Annual reviews of political science, a lot of review essays. When I did the preface to the new edition for Perception and Misperception, those of you who know the book, you don't have to read all of the second edition, because I did not change the content, the book itself. I did the 85 pages of what had happened in the last 40 years. So, and I could only do that because I could not go through all the psych journals. It'd just be impossible. I went through Annual Review of Psychology and some of sociology and political science, and went back to some of the articles. But the point is, the review articles are, a good crutch. Also a great shortcut, if you can, other graduate students or faculty who are in their discipline and just learning from them. But it's hard. And it's hard to avoid the blinkers that come. I think we expect much more from young scholars now than we did certainly when I was coming out, and even I think 30 years ago. And some ways is very good. I mean, you look at, again, the books certainly in our series, but in the second tier, like Princeton and Cambridge and the Oxford and Jim series, that when people are doing historical research, they really go pretty deeply. It's now standard for political science, at minimum, to have really good use of the foreign relations series, and usually, not always, depending how many case studies you're doing, but usually going to archives as well. That's really very impressive. On the other hand, it's going to have a cost. As you know, that research is very, very time consuming.
As you're talking about this, I keep thinking, you're still producing all this amazing work, but I keep thinking that the intellectual history of our field, like, you know it better than any. And I was thinking to myself, what would it look like if you wrote the intellectual history of the field? And I'm not going to ask you that because that would be, like, we could spend all night talking about that. But your last answer seemed very optimistic. And I wonder if you could talk about where you see our field, broadly defined security studies, grand strategy, international relations going. What are the things you're seeing? What are the things you worry about? What are the positive things? What are the trends?
Yes, and they're obviously both positive and negative. Starting with the good news, I think, when you, there are various things people bemoaning about the field, but I think if you look at the major book publishers and just look at the monographs that are basically rewritten dissertations, the quality level, in the sense both of good self-conscious theorizing, usually a good recognition also of the limits of what one can say, at least an acknowledgement of alternatives, sometimes done in I admit, somewhat mechanistic way, that I think that, and often multi-methods, and again, for the overlap we're concerned with, really quite impressive use of historical materials, and on interesting questions. It's really that I think is very impressive. Another good sign is increasing diversity in the field, number of ways. The obvious thing is gender. Again, the percentage of women is still, what have we got here, lower. What do you have here? 25, what?
7 out of 20.
7, all right. And it's interesting when I check around the table when I'm at academic meetings and government meetings. Government's done much better, which is interesting. I'm really struck by that. But I think, that's very much a good sign. Racial diversity, we used to be at 0 and now we're at 0.5%. It's still bad, especially if you think African Americans and Hispanics. It's no close to 0, I believe. I think that's unfortunate for our society. I think it's unfortunate for reaching our students. I find lower percentage of African American students in the introductory IR course, and I find a lower percentage than going on after that. I don't know. So I find that quite discouraging. But more broad, that level of diversity, I think, is, and gender, very encouraging. I think the intellectual diversity that I think we handle the political disputes in the field really quite well. The engagers versus the restrainers, they certainly more than talk to each other, are willing to hire each other's students. I don't think you get the research in that way polluted by the political disputes. I think the tolerance, again, for different, if you will, paradigms, not my favorite, is really pretty good. So, I think mostly just the quality, when you read even, any of the major journals, that, there are always going to be things, there's some good and bad, but it's hard to read an issue of one of the major journals, except for I.O., which is pretty deadening. But many journals, without finding 1, 2, or 3 articles, those are really, really interesting. And say to give a boost to our sponsor, that the Texas National Security Review has done some extremely interesting things, also that cross over in the history. The one on the Beirut decisions.
We have the author right here.
Oh, I
yeah,
thought that
Dr.
was-
Alexandra Evans.
Well, that's great. I thought that was a really, yes.
Hey, can I make a plug? You should publish your book on it in your series.
Well,
so.
I'd like to see. I think that article was extremely interesting and very well done. I won't say typical of what's done, but shows what is and can being done. Okay, the bad news. Well, one thing about the universities as a whole, I think we being IR and political science a little better, but I think there is a problem of political diversity. And when I was president of the APSA, this was in 2000 and 2001, I tried to get panels on this in the convention, and I did some columns for PS, and I think my colleagues are in denial. I think we have to ask ourselves, and the historians even more, that are there any consequences for our scholarship? It isn't that the teaching and our brainwashing. That's bullshit. I think that we don't do that. The humanities do that, but they're dying anyway. But back to your first question, the political spectrum, not on the foreign policy view, but general political orientation in the political science discipline runs the gamut from a reasonable socialist to centrist Democrat, right?
Yeah.
In my department, I'd say we usually try to have one Republican, but we don't want two lest we get a breeding pair. And right now, I don't think we have any. Now,
Well, Tom.
does what? Tom, yeah, that's right. Well, Tom's an independent, and Tom's not in the political science department.
Okay.
Now, does this matter in the research we produce? I cannot fully establish that it does. And there's a difference between domestic views and foreign policy, right? Quite a bit. But still, it worries me that, our basic views about society, how they work, how they should work, what's just and unjust, to say that this has no influence at all on the way we analyze world politics, that may be, but, offhand, that doesn't look right. And I find this troubling. There was a very good article in Social Psychology by Jonathan Haidt is the lead, and I know partly Phil Tetlock, Phil is one of the authors, and 3 or 4 others. They look at social psychology and they ask this question, and they, I think, demonstrate, and I mean demonstrate, it's not speculate, they show how the research in that field is distorted, or at least affected in ways by the consensus, the left liberal consensus. So I think a very important issue that we've not confronted. When we had a discussion in my department, again, diversity, all that, and Dick Betts and I had the temerity to mention intellectual diversity, and I mentioned this article, and I said, I've got it on my hard drive, and I'd be glad to send it to any of my colleagues who asked me for it, because it's really interesting. You can guess how many asked me for it. I think this is a real problem. Okay, the other problem in IR, of course, is the security studies is the embattled field. I think Steve Van Evera and John Mearsheimer may exaggerate a little, but not completely. Security studies is still viewed for many of our colleagues, especially more of the reformers, as if you study war, you must like it. Yeah. So, especially, if you say, here we have people who've analyzed genocide strategically. You've said that many genocides I think of Ben Valentino's very good book, out of the strategic calculations of the actors at the time. That does not sit well. So that's a real problem. The strong hold of rational choice theory is a little weaker now, but is still a problem. My friend and former student, John Mercer, whose book on reputation, many of you know, you can argue with it. I think he couldn't get a job for several years because people would say, one colleague who I like, not colleague in Columbia, but in the field, said, that can't be right. If that view is correct, I have to give up too many of my basic views. Well, consider that. And we know that for many of the people, that is not something they really want to think about. So that's a real problem. The hold of, statistical and large N studies, again, I think perfectly legitimate. That work has enriched the field. I don't use it. I do read it. I work with students who do it, all that. But the belief by the people who do it that that's the only, not the best kind of evidence, which it often, for some questions it is, often, but is the only, again, really is a problem we face. Ironically, there's a little like Godzilla versus one of the other monsters. Help is on the way in that if you thought the rational choice people were fanatics, you got to meet the experimentalists. And fortunately, of course, the experimentalists' main enemy are the large N people, because for them, observational data isn't meaningful data for causal analysis at all. So I have somewhat enjoyed the clash of the two, these two views that both have something to say for each other, for themselves, but not nearly as much as they think they do. And that may open some space for things, but that is a problem. There is, I think, that sort of a lack of tolerance. It isn't impossible, but it makes you sort of an uphill battle for the sort of students that you have here. But in a way, it means you have to up your game. And I think it is perfectly fair to say, look, someone's going to ask you to pin down why you think that's a causal relation, an argument we were having before. That's a perfectly fair question. Questions of endogeneity are not only statistical, they're broader here. So you thinking about the objections that you'll face for a paper you send out or the job market, that is hard, but many of those questions are legitimate. So in a way that is good, but it is still what we like to call a challenging environment. But finally, again, back to the good, is that in a way there's a broader interest in IR and security and in a broad issue that both of us were talking in the break. Policy schools, which didn't used to exist, now not only exist, but are much more interested in good academic research. And that think tanks often have many more things like that. Positions in the government, especially in the IC, a lot of room for people who think clearly and can bring theories to bear on evidence. So in a way, the landscape in that way has improved and gives grounds for optimism.
So I want to end this conversation by asking you, or pointing out something that I think we all know, but getting a reflection on, and that is on mentorship. You have here, Derek Chalet, we often Colin Collins here, the number of students that you have trained who have become academics, who've entered the policy world, and then you yourself talked about the benefits of the mentorship you received from Tom Schelling, Ken Waltz, and people like that. And you truly is one of the most remarkable aspects of your career. I wanted to, do you have thoughts of, is this just something that came naturally? Is it a lesson that you can give for the younger scholars here to think about the importance of the lessons you learned about mentorship, how you thought about it and came to it?
It's odd because, as I said in the piece for the annual review thing, that Berkeley, we were free-range graduate students. Good. Except for people who were doing political behavior, with Herb McCloskey, who was very good, and some of the regional things that we were turned loose. In fact, when I got to Harvard, and people said, "Well, who are you studying under?" Or who's supervising your dissertation? What? First, no one at Berkeley, none of the faculty would take the chair of because they didn't know what I was doing and didn't care. Fortunately, I'd been an undergraduate that when I was at Oberlin, Aaron Wildofsky, an American, has taken a course with Aaron, and Aaron had gone to Berkeley, and Aaron said, "Yeah, I'll be your director." So I got someone to sign. But it was a different way. And that generation, by the way, at Harvard was worse. Peter Gurevich, who some of you have done more comparative or know his marvelous work on the second image reverse, that he would get the chapter back from Stanley Hoffman with "excellent, keep going." There's another, the Harvard people, they just, even Sam, who changed, Sam Huntington, became more hands-on. At that point, zero. Anyway, partly, though, I found, even at Harvard and then at UCLA anymore, at Columbia, certainly I really enjoy working with my students, two of whom are here, and who I give copious comments on, hopefully encouraging comments. That and it's really very interesting because here you get very bright people who are working on interesting questions, and working with them on it is something that's always great fun. But the important thing, I think, in a mentor, which some people who are even good mentors don't do, is combining giving good comments and helping with realizing they're going to do what they want to do. It's going to succeed or it's going to fail. Not going to be because of anything you're telling them. And some people who are very good scholars, they say they don't want to turn out clones, but they really do. Or at least they feel they want people to do it their way. And one advantage of being a fox is, hey, lots of ways to do it well. And I think in trying to pick people who mentors, that's one thing you really want to look for. And it is unfortunate that some people who are good scholars and who care about the young people, but just have a feeling that if you're not doing what I'm particularly interested in or the way I'm doing it, not doing it right. But I think also the level of mentorship in the IR field is really, I think, pretty good. I think most of my colleagues, and I say not only at Columbia, where I can see and think people are good, but at other places really are quite good. But in the end, I have to say, I know when people look at some stuff and say, "Oh, the problem is we need more mentorship," there's a real limit on that. Now we at Columbia, every junior faculty, there's be a senior mentor, sort of what tricks of the trade. Yes, write something good, submit it. When it gets rejected, send it somewhere else. There isn't an enormous amount there, and I worry a little that some of the mentor discussion, is misguided and is a way to avoid a very hard question that I can't answer. That is, we can't predict who will turn out to, very, very well and who won't. Can't predict it when we admit to graduate school. This is my favorite statistic. In the old days, Columbia had very large PhD programs and very low scholarship, and we were making a lot of money for the university. So we would have 80 people in the entering class. And anyway, those are my joke, and it's true. The people we didn't admit to the program got PhDs at a higher rate than those we admitted. How could this happen? Well, I will tell you. There were 3 cases when we rejected, but the graduate office pushed the wrong button on the computer, and they came. And one of them flunked out. All of them did very badly in my first semester IR class. One of them then dropped out. 2 continued and got PhDs. Now, there's a trick here. It's self-selection. There may have been a lot of other people who we admitted by accident who didn't come. So these people were probably very, very dedicated. But you can't predict. Even then, you say on high junior faculty hiring, yes, there's some prediction, far less than 100%. And then if you ask, the crop of newly minted associate professors, can you predict on the next level? Some, but not completely. Tremendously internally generated. Very hard. I mean, some things in your personal life, that my wife and I somewhat distribute the credit a little differently, but anyway, there is that. There is things, you just can't tell. There are the inherent unpredictability, so that I worry a little to talk on mentorship too much, I think, underplays the inherent uncertainty in the enterprise.
Well, I think we could continue this for hours and hours longer, but we have another session we have to move to. I want to thank you not just for talking to us tonight, but for all that you've done. You're just, despite what you've said about mentorship, you've been a mentor to me, even though I wasn't your student, but your example has been an exemplar to many. And so please join me in thanking Robert Jervis for everything he does.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.